we've put together this session specifically for adults with cystic fibrosis to take you through your work and employment rights. So the first thing I'm going to do is hand over one by one to our panel so that they can just say hello and tell you who they are. So Sangeeta, can we start with you?
Hi everybody, I'm Sangeeta. I'm the Welfare and Rights Advisor at the Cystic Fibrosis Trust. Looking forward to sharing some information with you all today.
Thanks, Sangeeta. And Nikki?
Hi guys, I'm Nikki, a Welfare Officer at the Trust.
Thank you. And Agnes?
I'm Agnes Tansinda. I'm a social worker at the Manchester Adult Cystic Fibrosis Centre. And I'm also the social work one of the social work representatives on the UK Psychosocial Group. We normally call it the UK PPCF. So hello to everyone.
Thanks, Agnes. And Shane?
Shane Crawford, 5 paper chambers in Temple in London. I specialise in employment law, which encompasses discrimination, which obviously would touch on individuals with disability in the workplace. So nice to meet you all.
Thank you. So just to sort of give you the context for all of you in which we're holding this, I'm sure you'll be well aware that we are holding this at a time when the cystic fibrosis community is dealing with COVID and an ever-changing situation and what that means for work and your personal finances. And we know from a recent poll that we did on social media that 70% of people with CF told us that the pandemic has caused them additional worries with their personal finances. We know there's continuing uncertainty in respect of COVID. Things are changing rapidly, and I want to reassure you that anything that we know, we are sharing with you when we have it. So we're keeping our web pages up to date. The respective nations' government statements in the recent days haven't yet suggested any return to shielding, so shielding remains paused apart from in a few very specific local lockdown areas, but we're monitoring that every day, and we're working with the Cystic Fibrosis Medical Association to make sure that the voices of people with CF are being heard and your needs are known about. So I hope that helps to reassure you that we're in your corner and sharing any information we have. But at times of uncertainty, and this is certainly one, it's really important that you know your rights, and that's been built on further recently by the announcement that many in the CF community will benefit from new medication from Kaftrio, and I know change is exciting, but also for some people that brings additional uncertainty, so we'll be touching on that as well. So we're going to start with Shane, and we're very fortunate to have an employment law expert. Shane is one of my friend's colleagues and has very generously given his time, and I know he's new to cystic fibrosis, but an expert in employment law. So thank you, Shane, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Becky. Good evening, everybody. I asked Becky for 2 things before I gave the talk. First was some background information about cystic fibrosis, and I've looked at your websites and I have a clearer understanding of the symptoms and the sorts of things that you face. I also asked for some steer on what sorts of things you might be wanting to hear about tonight, and Becky very kindly forwarded to me 3 core questions which appeared to be repeated many times at the Trust. Certainly the people who use the Trust and use its advisory facilities were putting these forward. And they were these. I'll read them out. What are my rights in returning to work after shielding as furlough ends? My employer has taken steps to make my workplace COVID secure, but my cystic fibrosis team still don't feel it's safe for me to go back to work. What do I do now? And the third one was, can my employer force me to come back to work? They say they have made the workplace COVID secure, but I don't feel safe. Now, I will have to say to you that in the background, where I am living, is a 3-year-old and a 9-week-old baby. So if you hear things going on or see the door open, it won't be a news night situation, because I'm not really precious like that. If Thomas runs in, I'll just break off, say goodnight to him, and then carry on. So if I deal with the first question, what are my rights in returning to work after shielding as furlough ends? And as is always the case, whether you are returning from shielding or not, cystic fibrosis would almost certainly bring you within the Equality Act, and therefore you would have the right not to be unlawfully discriminated against in the workplace. Specifically, the areas where that question might arise would be, is there something arising as a consequence of the cystic fibrosis that is causing my employer to treat me unfavourably? And lawyers refer to that as something arising as a consequence of disability discrimination, or the vernacular is Section 15, because it is Section 15 claim. And in essence, that is looking at instances where the less favourable or unfavourable treatment which you're encountering is not because you have cystic fibrosis, but it might be something which is arising from cystic fibrosis. It might be that you, because of the symptoms, you couldn't possibly work in a very dusty environment, or you might not be able to walk many, many flights of stairs without taking your time, perhaps. But essentially, it is not just the cystic fibrosis, it is something arising from that. It can be that you have a greater number of sickness absence days. That would be something arising. So trying to pull it back to this context, if you can see potentially that the provisions made for you are you're less than happy with them, and you can see that something arising as a symptom of your cystic fibrosis will mean that you will struggle more, it might be the case that you can say to your employer, look, this arises as a result of my cystic fibrosis. I'm not in a position, therefore, to undertake the work as it's set out at the moment. And if you continue with this, then how am I to actually engage in what you want me to do? And it can be very broad. It's really tying it to that, or trying to think of what is the thing arising from my disability that is causing my employer to treat me less favourably. Now, as I said, I'm very new to cystic fibrosis, so I can't think of all those eventualities. But coming from a safe haven at home into an environment which might not be as secure as you would want it, potentially might be a situation arising where a Section 15 claim is something that you can seek to enforce. I think, though, the most likely area that engages employment law, and certainly the protection against unlawful discrimination, is the reasonable adjustments type situation. And what I would say to you is that you have to clearly identify the work practice which puts you at a disadvantage compared to individuals who don't have your condition. Lawyers refer to it PCPs. That means provision, criterion, or practice, and that's because in the statute, that is the concept that the lawyers will be looking for. So the analysis is whether there are impediments to you undertaking work due to a particular practice or criteria or provision, such that there is a duty then on the employer to make some adjustments to facilitate you and enable you to come and do your work, because the whole idea of disability discrimination is not what you can do. Everyone understands that. It's where you struggle, and to try and level the playing pitch a little bit and say, okay, well, if we do this and this will facilitate Shane to actually do his job. The only reason he can't do his job is not because he's not able at his job. It's just that whatever the disability is prevents him from doing it in the way that an able-bodied person would do. The process of arguing failure to make reasonable adjustment is a question of fact for a tribunal. And the tribunal generally asks itself first whether there is a duty to make reasonable adjustments, and secondly whether there has been a failure to meet that obligation. These are very fact-sensitive type cases. In assessing the first question, the tribunal must ask itself whether there is a substantial disadvantage by the imposition of whatever work practice is imposed on the person, and that because of the condition, whatever it is, the disability, that person is suffering a disadvantage. And again, it's a very broad approach to that. The concept of disadvantage is objectively considered. That's really so that there's some measure as to what is disadvantage and what is not, because you will have very extreme instances. By that I mean what objectively, in objective standards, you might think isn't a disadvantage. So that's considered by the tribunal. The evaluation of the second question, namely, has the employer met that obligation, includes the assessment of the reasonableness of the adjustment that's proposed. So that includes a spectrum of considerations, which includes cost of whatever the adjustment is and the effectiveness of that adjustment. But those aren't the only considerations. There has to be a balancing act done in trying to conclude whether the adjustment that's being sought is reasonable or is not. And those types of rights, employment rights, are ones which you enforce in the tribunal. The process is all online and is self-explanatory, but if you do need assistance, ACAS would be the first point of call, some form of law centre or Citizens Advice Bureau. But any person who has access to the internet, who can read and write, will be able to understand what the form is asking him or her and fill it out and then submit it. The 2 points that I would emphasise is that you must go to ACAS first. The idea is that if you do have a problem with your employer, the idea is you would go to ACAS, try and engage in some conciliatory process whereby the two parties, you and your employer, through ACAS, try and work it out without litigating it. If that doesn't bear any fruit, you then get a certificate from ACAS and you can go and then take your claim. The second thing is that there is a limitation period if you want to go to a tribunal. By that I mean from the moment that you were discriminated against or you have knowledge of it, you have 3 months to lodge your claim. Now, that can vary if there are circumstances where the discrimination is ongoing. So if the practice at work is something that you've maybe raised as a grievance, raised with your employer doesn't do anything, the clock doesn't necessarily start immediately you have raised the complaint, because it might be reasonable to see if your employer does want to actually seek some sort of process whereby they can facilitate you in the way that you have outlined. Also, by going to ACAS, you stop the clock. So if the ACAS process takes 1 month, in that 3-month period, the clock is stopped for the month that ACAS is undertaking the conciliatory process, and if it doesn't bear fruit, the clock comes back on again. So that's something maybe to think about. The other thing that when I was considering this question was the health and safety angle. There is an obligation on employers to undertake or provide a safe working environment to work in. And that comes under the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974, Section 2. The assessment is whether it is reasonable or reasonably practicable. And it's a balancing exercise between quantifying the risk to health and safety in respect of whatever activity is giving rise to that health and safety risk, and what's sometimes referred to as the sacrifice that the employer will have to make, the time and money and trouble that the employer has to put in to make that system safe. Now, of course, if you're working with plant machinery and dynamite, then there will be an expectation that there'll be very high safety procedures. And the way in which it's considered is if the sacrifice is grossly disproportionate to the risk, then the employer has managed to show that the measures which are requested by the employee are considered disproportionate. The thing to remember, though, in relation to Health and Safety at Work Act is that it's enforced by the Health and Safety Executive or a local authority. Local authorities deal with care homes primarily, and the Health and Safety Executive deal with pretty much anything else. And so if you feel that this is an avenue that you would want to pursue, the best thing that you can do is contact the Health and Safety Executive and find out from them whether what is being presented to you is going to be a risk to health and safety. Although I think on balance, probably the better avenue might be to seek to say, they're not making a reasonable adjustment here in order to facilitate me going back to work. So I've cantered through that. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, my employer has taken steps to make my workplace COVID secure, but my CF team still don't feel it's safe for me to go back to work. What do I do now? Well, in disability discrimination, the law is that the employer will have to meet the obligations that are judged to be a reasonable adjustment. Tribunals are guided significantly by expert assessment, and I've no doubt that some of the listeners tonight might have used Access to Work, the government agency which will come into a workplace and assess the area or location where you work and tell the employee you need to do this, this, this and this. And that's a fairly watertight standard, because if the employer doesn't meet those standards, unless there is a very good reason, like the cost is astronomical and couldn't do it, potentially, then they have failed to meet their obligation. In terms of making a workplace safe to the standard that would be required if you suffer from cystic fibrosis, it may be that there is provision for an argument that provisions implemented by your employer put you at a substantial disadvantage, and that they need to do a bit extra for you. And if they don't do a bit extra for you, they've failed to meet their obligation in terms of reasonable adjustment. I would say I can't give you a definitive answer. It really depends on the extent of the symptoms from which you suffer. And probably the best advice would be for the cystic fibrosis team to liaise with the employer where possible, explaining why measures provided by the employer perhaps don't meet the high standards in order to prevent you suffering because of the disability of cystic fibrosis. Moving to the final question, can my employer force me to come back to work? They say they have made the place COVID secure, but I don't feel safe. I would say your options are fairly stark if that is the situation you find yourself in, because if a clinical team agree that the workplace is low risk, that might be of a standard whereby the employer can say, well, I've met that standard, I can't do more, or I don't want to do more, and I have some professional and informed opinion to say this is sufficiently secure to be low risk. And would be, I would guess, sufficient to say to the employee, well, you know, please come back to work now. There is the option of resigning and claiming constructive dismissal, and that the failure to make this reasonable adjustment caused you to resign and caused the constructive dismissal. But that might be quite difficult to litigate. No one can force you to come back to work, but it might lead on to some form of capability or conduct procedure whereby you would be the subject of that procedure, and you would have to engage with that to the extent that the employer would want to advance its argument to you that, look, we've done all that we can and we've got to this point, and if you don't come back now, there's going to be a first written warning, perhaps, or worse, just depending on what their policy is. So I hope that brief talk is insightful and the types of things that you wanted to hear tonight. I'm looking at my clock, not because I don't mind staying, but like I say, there are certain father duties that I could be getting on with, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I haven't looked at any comments or chat, but if anyone does have a question, I will gladly try and answer it. I'm sorry it's a bit gloomy in here. but if I put the overhead light on, you'll all be blinded.
Thank you so much, Shane, for that, and thank you to 5 Paper Chambers as well. We will probably have to stick to our planned schedule, because
Okay.
we've got quite a bit to get through.
Right.
But for people who are asking questions now on the chat, or for anyone who asks anything that we haven't picked up on today, we're going back to via our helpline team in the next day or two. So we'll also be sharing this video when it's all finalised, so it'll be available for people as a resource to sort of work through if they want to. So a huge thank you to you, and I shall let you off the hook so that you can do fatherly duties, but
Well,
thank you very much.
So I will say cheerio and enjoy the seminar and presentation tonight. Okay, bye-bye.
Brilliant, thank you. So I am going to hand over to Agnes now, as an experienced CF social worker, to talk about her experiences so far of her patients returning to work following COVID-19 and shielding, and the role that CF social workers have been taking in supporting them. So Agnes, over to you.
Thank you, Becky. So the information I'm going to be sharing with you is not just my personal experience. I've spoken to other social workers in our group and some of my colleagues as well. So it's a joint effort and feedback from a few of the patients that have gone back to work. I would like to start by just putting it, because we're talking about the impact of COVID on people with CF going back to work. I think it might be important to just put it in some kind of a context, looking at the most recent data relating to the number of people who have been diagnosed with COVID. So this information is from the CF registry, and it was provided by the Cystic Fibrosis Medical Association. So from the 1st of March to the 13th of September, there have been 33 COVID cases in people with CF, which have been reported. Out of this number, there are 30 people who have recovered from the infection. 2 people are still receiving treatment, and unfortunately, there has been 1 death which was reported at the beginning of the COVID crisis. So looking at this data from when it was collected, I think it's worth noting that it includes the period from July to September, when pubs, restaurants, and other public institutions reopened, when shielding for people considered high risk of COVID was officially ended, and people were required to go back to work or to return to work, and also the period when schools reopened. The consensus by the CF Medical Association from this data is that the number of cases in the UK so far is still too low to draw any conclusions about the risk factor or outcomes associated with COVID-19 in cystic fibrosis. My interpretation of this is that one could argue that during that period, the period from July to September, many people with CF may have been going out and coming into contact with a few more members of the public, albeit taking measures to protect themselves. The incidence of COVID for people had been expected, for people with CF had been expected during this COVID period to be extremely high, and it was initially feared. So I think it's reassuring for a lot of people, particularly those who have gone back to work, that numbers are still low. There is a but. The but is, unfortunately, the recent increasing prevalence of the virus, which has prompted local lockdowns and the prediction of a second wave, which has led to the government announcing yesterday of tighter restrictions again, is worrying. And it's likely to influence the decision of people who are still thinking about returning to work. But the good news is, a good number of people with CF are still able to work from home. So, for thinking about those who have gone back into work, the general view is that although initially many people were quite anxious, and a few people have felt that they were forced back into work because of the threat of losing their jobs. These were particularly people working in areas where it is more challenging to implement COVID secure measures. So we look at teachers, people working in hospitality and industry, shop floor workers. Other people, such as people who are self-employed, felt they had no choice because of their financial circumstance, and so they had to go back to work. However, on the other hand, the view of those who have actually returned to work have generally been positive. Some people have reported that it has been good for their confidence, their mental and physical well-being, seeing their colleagues again and being more active. Some have said they were bored at home with little to occupy their time and spending a lot of time shopping online and eating. And so they've had to they've put on more weight. And so it's a good opportunity for them to get out and about again and try and exercise more. So when asked about what has helped them to settle back in work, many people reported that their employers had been very supportive and had taken steps to make their work environment COVID secure, and so they felt safe. Some were also satisfied with the reasonable adjustments offered to them by their employers, like starting work early, working in a different role, leaving work early, etc., etc. With regards to the support from social workers, I would say that some of our patients have been proactive and contacted their social workers to discuss their situation before returning to work. The advice and support we as social workers have been offering people so far is for them to consider reasonable adjustments before they return to work, to ensure that their employers conduct risk assessment for them in particular before returning to work. We also ask them to ensure that things like face covering, social distancing is implemented in the office, shop floor, and communal areas like kitchens, bathrooms or toilets, etc., staff rooms, etc., etc. And that their employers have provided sanitizers, limited number of people in the work place, depending on the size of the office. If their work, however, has visitors high volumes, for example, like in cafes, pubs, then we ask them to suggest to their employers to make sure that the NHS test and trace policy is implemented. We also found that some people hadn't contacted their employers before starting work to discuss their individual circumstance. In our center in Manchester, we have put out this information on Facebook, on our Facebook page, asking people to do so or to contact their social worker for advice before returning to work. During lockdown, we think that some of our patients, I'm talking now particularly in Wythenshawe, Manchester, some of our patients have had the time to spend looking after their health and have experienced some benefit. and have decided to consider early retirement on health grounds. So social workers, I mean, this obviously is a stressful period. And so social workers have helped them to go through that process. And I think it is important. I brought this particular issue because I think this is also an opportunity for people to start thinking about their pension. We're talking here about money. So I think if you are thinking you may have to retire probably earlier for health reasons, then thinking about a private pension or joining works pension or whichever pension is also very important. So on the whole, I think it has generally been positive. I think one or two people have said that if there is a second wave and there is a lockdown, if their workplaces are still open, they will consider going back to work. So I think on the whole, there are some people who feel safe because of the support from either their employers, and also we shouldn't underestimate how they themselves have taken the steps to make sure they are respecting social distancing and all the other suggestions that are out there to minimize contracting COVID. So I think that's what I would say is the general feeling from people who have returned to work.
Great, thank you so much, Agnes. I just wanted to pick up on one of the questions that's come in on the chat because it's relevant to what Agnes has said and also to what Shane said earlier. Both have mentioned the importance of reasonable adjustments. The question that's come in on the chat is, do I have to disclose my illness to my employer? And the answer to that is quite quick. You don't have to disclose your illness. You don't have to disclose cystic fibrosis, but if you don't, it does affect your rights. So in order to qualify for things like reasonable adjustments, your employer does need to know that you have cystic fibrosis. So you do need to disclose it in order to access those rights. And that's very similar to the way we at the Trust and Shane, as well as a legal expert, talk about disability in relation to cystic fibrosis. We know that's not a word that everyone with CF necessarily uses to describe themselves. Some are comfortable with it, some are not, but it is a word that's relevant for your rights, because under the definition in the Equality Act, which is applicable in England, Scotland and Wales, and the Disability Discrimination Act in Northern Ireland, cystic fibrosis does fall under the definition of a disability and therefore gives you rights in relation to discrimination. We do have some information resources, in particular a pack which has been linked to in the chat, which does have information on work and reasonable adjustments and also information to help you explain cystic fibrosis to your employer. So I'm going to turn to Sangeeta next, because we're going to start sort of moving from work towards benefits. Just before I do that, I just wanted to pick up on a particular issue in Scotland in relation to work. We're aware of a government risk assessment tool which effectively calculates your COVID age. It's specific to Scotland, and we know some people have had concerns that identifies them in a low risk group. If you're in Scotland and that has affected you, the key thing to remember there is that it doesn't override your rights under the Equality Act to reasonable adjustments, and that individual advice from your CF team is still important. That tool is just generic, and we would hope that employers would defer to specialist advice from your CF team. So if you're finding yourself in Scotland that a decision is being made by your employer on the basis of that assessment, get in touch with your CF team and ask them about liaising with your employer. Obviously, cystic fibrosis social workers have been doing an amazing job, but unfortunately they're not present in all CF centres. So we also have our wonderful welfare team at the Trust, Sangeeta and Nikki, who you can come to via our helpline. So if you're sort of listening to this and thinking, well, I don't have a social worker to turn to, you can come to us via our helpline. So Sangeeta, we had a specific question which relates to statutory sick pay. So from someone whose consultant who works in a higher risk environment, and their consultant has advised that they shouldn't go back to work, but they've been told they will only get statutory sick pay. Sangeeta, I wondered if you could pick that up and perhaps talk a little bit more about benefits and eligibility.
Absolutely, yes. That particular question, lots of people have come to us with a similar situation, and lots of social workers have also reported it to be the case. And what has been happening is people who are wanting to return to work, but their cystic fibrosis team has told them that they aren't safe to return to work because of their particular workplace or their conditions. Their employers have been saying to them that there's only statutory sick pay available in that situation. So a couple of things about that particular situation. Whilst your employer might tell you that statutory sick pay is the only thing that they're willing to pay you, there are other things that you may be able to claim from the statutory benefit system which could top you up, and also whether you can claim statutory sick pay itself is also going to depend on the evidence you get from your cystic fibrosis team. So it can be problematic. Essentially, what I would say is it's important for anyone in this situation to get your benefits checked. And what that means is that you would go to either your cystic fibrosis social worker or myself, or even an independent advice agency, and ask for a benefits check. And what they would do is ask you a lot of questions about your personal situation to work out whether you're entitled to anything, which in itself is quite a lengthy and complex thing for an advisor to do, but really important. What you can claim essentially depends on whether you're going to be able to work or able to look for work, or whether you can be considered as having a limitation on your capability for work. So that would be the first choice for somebody to make about their own circumstances. Again, as I mentioned before, that can be problematic because it could be that you feel absolutely fine, even if you have cystic fibrosis, but that your workplace is not considered secure, or it's not considered safe for you, and your cystic fibrosis team don't consider it to be advisable for you to go back. So the question of medical evidence then will have to be discussed, and a benefits advisor will be able to talk you through all of this. On top of statutory sick pay, you might be able to get something like universal credit, or you may be already receiving tax credits. So you may be able to have your tax credits reassessed. So you may have some options, and it's not necessarily going to be right for you to just take up one option without considering the other. And you may have to weigh up in which situation you're better off. Which is what a benefits advisor like myself or your cystic fibrosis social worker can help you to look at. So there are lots of situations that we find people in, and there are often quite a few options. Some of them are not easy, but certainly we can inform you as to what those choices are so that you can make a good decision as to what you want to do. Also, how to claim the benefit, when to claim it, which is going to be the most beneficial for you, and also to take you through the claims process. Agnes, did you want to say anything about supporting people, or have I covered that before I move on to PIP?
I think you've covered that, but I just want to say that, you know, we are social workers, we're not advice, benefit or welfare rights advisors. So we may not be more of an expert or much more of an expert than you are. In fact, we normally come to you for more support when it's to do with complex benefit advice. So.
Okay, thanks, Agnes. We've had some other questions, particularly around eligibility for specific benefits. The one that's very the one that we've been commonly asked is about personal independence payment. We've been asked whether people could be entitled to that as well as working. We've been asked whether people can be entitled to that as well as working part-time or full-time. And we've been asked about whether people can claim something if their health is not as good as it used to be. So I'll just take you through some of the rules about PIP, which is personal independence payment. So personal independence payment is a benefit that can help with some of the extra costs caused by long-term ill health or a disability. It's essentially for people who are aged 16 to 64, and the entitlement to PIP is assessed on your ability to carry out 10 daily living activities and 2 mobility activities. Those activities are then divided further into something called descriptors, which is something we talk about a lot at the Trust. Your entitlement to PIP does hinge on these descriptors, and you can get a copy of the descriptors if you contact our helpline. We can send them out to you so that you can use them to assess yourself. PIP is not a means tested benefit, and what that means is that your income and your savings are not taken into account when assessing eligibility for PIP. It's also not only for those who are unable to work, and plenty of people who work part-time or full-time can claim PIP. This is because PIP depends on how you score against the descriptors, and these are supposed to look at what difficulties you have in 12 activity areas. Sometimes it's not easy to understand how these descriptors fit you. So again, I would emphasize the importance of seeking advice on those. And I spend a lot of my working week having conversations with people about those 12 activity areas and how those descriptors fit them and their circumstances. And some of those PIP descriptors are broader than they look on paper, and some of them are narrower, and there's no leeway with it. But people with cystic fibrosis often say that the PIP descriptors on paper don't look as if they apply to them, but all I can say is seek advice, because we'll talk to you about your health condition in the context of those PIP descriptors, and you never know, you may be surprised, you may be entitled to something when you didn't think that you were. It's absolutely worth having that conversation with myself or your social worker, and social workers are experienced, very experienced with dealing with PIP. So you need to have that conversation. It could be really helpful. Okay, we've had some other questions around benefits as well. What I'll tell you about is that since lockdown, so since March, we've had lots and lots of different situations. We've heard from people who've been shielding and have been furloughed, people who've lost their jobs, people who have reduced their hours or lost overtime and gone to basic pay. We've heard from people who are facing redundancy, as well as those who have had changes in their circumstances totally unrelated to coronavirus, such as maternity or a change in their health, either for the better or for the worse. Also remember that we can support your carers and your families to check that they're also getting all the right support that they're entitled to. So our services are not just for you, they're also for your carers or your family members. Changes in circumstances in your household sometimes mean that you might need to claim universal credit, and that's something you will have heard a lot about in the newspapers and online. It might be that you're claiming benefits for the first time, so that this is a complete shock to you, or it might be that you're in receipt of benefits, but you might want to have your benefits checked so that you're getting everything that you should be getting. Or you may have had a change in circumstances. So people come to us at all different stages of their lives, not just because of coronavirus, and it's worth getting benefits advice in any of those situations. If you have a choice of what to claim, then you need to make sure that you're not going to be worse off by claiming universal credit. But it's one of those benefits that once you claim it, there's almost definitely no going back. And it's one of those benefits that if you claim it, it can automatically end other benefits such as tax credits. So it's really important to check which are you going to be worse off or better off. You could be financially better off by claiming universal credit, and of course you could be worse off. Claiming universal credit could end your tax credit award immediately, as well as other benefits. Those who are already on benefits, such as tax credits, need to decide whether they'd be financially better off remaining on those benefits. There have also been some changes in the benefit system over the last 6 months. And one of the main changes is the way that PIP assessments have been carried out. In the past, PIP assessments were mainly carried out face-to-face, but of course, because of the risk of COVID, that hasn't been able to happen. And since March, the Department for Work and Pensions decided that face-to-face assessments would be suspended and that assessments would be carried out by telephone instead. In July, the Department for Work and Pensions announced that face-to-face assessments are going to remain suspended. And so it is likely that if you've either applied for personal independence payment or you have a review or a reassessment of your personal independence payment for any reason, that the Department for Work and Pensions could expect you to have a telephone assessment. And we do have a fact sheet on our website, which will give you some information about that. The other thing to note is that the Department for Work and Pensions are also gradually starting to do reassessments and reviews again, whereas all this activity was suspended during the first 6 months of the pandemic. What we've noticed on the helpline and also from other welfare rights advisors is that the activity seems to be going back to normal numbers now. So it may be that you received a form 4 or 5 months ago and the DWP said that you didn't need to do anything, but it may be that they've now been in touch and said that you do have a deadline and it is time for you to go through your reassessment. In terms of disability benefits, it's important for me to say to you now that if you do get a disability benefit like personal independence payment and you have a change in your needs and you think you're entitled to a higher amount of PIP, you can contact the DWP and ask them to look at it again, but I would say please be certain that, and obviously being certain means getting some really good advice and some medical evidence to back you up that you're actually entitled to something higher. Because if you ask for the DWP to reassess you, they can look at the whole award again and there is a risk of you losing something. And of course, we wouldn't want you to be in that situation, quite worrying. In terms of telephone assessments, I've mentioned our fact sheet already, but I have some top tips for you for dealing with telephone assessments. My number one tip, which is something I say to everyone who's going through PIP, is get advice on how the descriptors apply to you. Pick the right ones and have a conversation with your advisor or your cystic fibrosis social worker as to which are the right ones so that you can be certain that you're making a good claim with a good foundation. The second one is that if you have a call that's you're expecting a call from an assessor, that as soon as you find out when that call is going to be, that you have some notes ready. So don't do the assessment without having some notes. That would be absolutely fine for you to have some notes while you're on the telephone. The third tip I have is to make sure that you're in a comfortable space, you have plenty of water to drink and a fully charged phone, because there's nothing worse than obviously not feeling that you can give your best evidence over the telephone. Number 4 is to talk about all the different ways that your cystic fibrosis can affect you. So even the really embarrassing things, because an assessor really needs to know exactly how your cystic fibrosis affects you, because as you will know that you are all different. And my 5th tip is to have someone to support you if you feel nervous. It's going to be understandable that you're feeling nervous and you are allowed to have somebody there to support you. It's difficult to have that person there if you were shielding. Obviously that may have been maybe something that you can now do if you have a support bubble and you have somebody who can come and help you. But if you don't, then the assessors can organise a 3-way phone conversation as well, so you can have support over the telephone. And lastly, in case I haven't said it enough times, we have a fact sheet on telephone assessments. So please have a look at that. And everything I've said about PIP assessments on the telephone is in that fact sheet. So that's all for me for now. And I'll be back later.
Thank you, Sangeeta. I think the thread that runs through all of this that we sort of all agree on is get advice, and we at the Trust and your social workers are here to support you with that advice. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to move to a slightly different subject away from COVID, which we've mostly talked about so far, and on to Kaftrio. So I know it's just been sort of summed up perfectly actually in one of the questions that's come in on the chat. We're obviously really excited about the fact that many in the CF community will benefit from Kaftrio, notwithstanding that those who won't remain obviously critically important to us at the Trust. So I apologise for those who this isn't relevant. I hope everything else here has been, but we wanted to touch on something that's been coming into us and I know has been coming into the social workers about if you do have an improvement in health through taking Kaftrio, how that could change your eligibility for benefits. And I think we all completely understand that for many with CF, they're either your only income or a hugely important part of your income. So the first thing I would say is we completely understand this concern and don't be afraid to ask these questions. Agnes, I wondered if I could hand over to you, because I think this is something that you've heard through the CF social workers. What sort of questions have been coming in for you and concerns that you've heard? Oh, sorry, Agnes, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so first of all, I would just like to say that many people who have been on Kaftrio, like you said, Becky, have experienced the benefit of it. And some of them have described it as life-transforming treatment, of course. And this is good news. And because it means a brighter future, not just for a health perspective, but also from a social perspective. I think it probably will provide a lot of new opportunities for some people who have never thought about work, going to college, education, and other career options. I think people who are already in work may also be looking at different career for themselves, changing career, and I think on the whole, that is good. But there might be others for whom the health improvement may have financial implications and work expectations, particularly on people's benefit entitlement. When we consider the eligibility criteria, which Sangeeta has already pointed out. So we are aware that some people are already thinking about this, but we would like to stress that, you know, in as much as it is a concern from a financial point of view, we would like to stress that people's situations are different. And if people are thinking seriously about starting the medication or are already on it, please speak to your social worker or contact the CF Trust Advice officers if you do not have a social worker in your center, so that you can go through the support that you may benefit from before, so you can make an informed decision about your income. I think that obviously there are people who will very likely be losing part of their benefit. That is no doubt something that we are thinking will happen. Again, this is looking at the criteria of PIP and all the other employment and support allowance and universal credit benefits. So the general consensus is that people should think about contacting their social worker for advice. And for those people, we also need to think about those people who are currently not eligible. And we will continue to support them. But I think the medics are also very hopeful that there will be something for them in the near future, which is similar to Kaftrio, hopefully. So that's the message we would like to put out there.
Thank you, Agnes. Sangeeta, did you want to add anything to that?
Just a little, just to say that it's not uncommon that people's health can improve. Obviously, this is something new in terms of how much the improvement may be, but it's not something that's going to present a difficulty for us as advisors. You know, we know that it's difficult for you, but we will help you to navigate the system, to understand the criteria, to challenge decisions where they're not right, you know, because it's going to be subtle. There's going to be some subtle things that we need to talk to you about. But please don't hesitate to ask us. You know, we feel that we can help you in this situation. So please don't feel that you can't ask. And please don't assume that you're not entitled to something, because, you know, we're not promising that you'll remain entitled to everything that you get currently. Absolutely no one can do that. I mean, even people have their benefits stopped when they shouldn't be, so it's uncertain with benefits, but we can help you get potentially the right decision for you, and to help you fight for the right decision for you if the government don't get it right. So that's what we're here for, and also to make sure you're armed with that information so that you can make really good choices for yourself.
Thanks, Sangeeta. And finally, before we wrap up, and I hope people don't mind that we're running slightly over time, Nikki, could I come to you? So we're talking about situations here potentially where people's income may change, whether that's through a change in work related to the pandemic or not, whether that's through a change in their benefits. Could you briefly sort of talk us through your income maximisation service and how you support people through that, and any tips you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi guys. So at the Trust, with the Income Maximisation Service, we offer individual and tailored support to talk through your household circumstances and any possible changes, and consider together all of the options available to help increase your income, looking at things like welfare benefits, but tax allowances, grants and so on. We also talk about ways to make your money go further by finding savings and discounts where possible. If anyone is concerned, speak to your CF team or the Trust via the helpline, and do check out their financial support pages on our website as well. Considering things that you can do if your income falls or if you're struggling to make ends meet, my top tips, which I've noticed is a theme throughout this talk, so that's quite cool. My top tips would have to include sitting down and working out your budget. It is a great way to help you understand what you're earning and spending, and where you might be able to cut costs. Have a benefit check, as Sangeeta mentioned, to make sure you're not missing out. There are some online tools that you can use, but do contact a helpline or other advice agency for support. Avoid or over-renewing on insurance policies and energy and phone contracts without looking elsewhere first. Shopping around can save you a bundle. My home insurance was up for renewal this month. I wasn't going to check, but I sort of finally did last week. After a quick 5-minute check, I found a 300 quid cheaper elsewhere. So I'm really glad I looked. Shopping around to save applies to many things, from bread and butter to gas and electric. So give it a go and see if you can switch and save. If you're on a low income and not entitled to free prescriptions, the NHS low income scheme may help cover some or all of the costs depending on your circumstances. Check out again the financial support pages on our website. I'm really proud of that. The team have done a great job. It's got loads of tips on saving and cost cutting ideas focused around different life stages. And for tailored support around your circumstances, do contact our helpline and request an Income Max appointment. If you are in a financial crisis, look at the grant section on our website or contact our helpline, and of course speak to your CF team.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and I think it's a really important thing we can do to support people at the moment as things are changing or uncertain. So do get in touch with our helpline if you want to have a chat with Nikki. I think that given the time, we'll probably have to wrap up there. I hope overall that people have taken away the kind of key theme here, which is that we and your CF teams and CF social workers are here to support you with all of this. There is advice out there, and we feel it's really important that you have that advice, whatever's going on in the world, but particularly at the moment when there's uncertainty around. So please do contact us or your social workers if you need any support, or even if you just want to find out more about anything that we've talked about today. We haven't been able to get to all of the specific questions on the chat, but I hope for most of them we've covered something similar, but we will try and pick them up via our helpline team if we can get back to you later. There's also a lot of information. I know there were some questions about flexible furlough and how that will change. We updated the employment coronavirus section of our website yesterday, so that's really detailed. It is really detailed sort of legal information, and if you're having trouble kind of working out which bit applies for you or which bit you need to look at, do give our helpline team a ring and they can guide you through it, or drop them an email. So I think that's it from us. We are next running one of these CF live Zoom sessions in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, the 7th of October, and that will be about how we're working to beat antimicrobial resistance in cystic fibrosis. I had a sneak preview of that today and it looks absolutely fascinating. You'll be able to hear from a panel of CF researchers on what's involved in tackling drug-resistant CF infections and why that's so important, and to ask questions about that research. So I hope today has been interesting. I feel like we've given you a lot of detailed information, but you can watch it all back. And also we have a huge range of resources around work specific to coronavirus, but also more general around benefits. And if there's anything you need, any questions you have, do contact the helpline. We might sound like a helpline in a call centre, but we're actually a really small team who work really closely together. So you can be assured of a friendly, helpful response, and we'll put you onto the right person. So I shall wish everybody a good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us.